Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow on the Land of Israel Network, my show, Rejuvenation. I want to thank Ben and Tabitha, as usual, for helping me get the show out on the air. I am sitting here on what was, well, it would have been the former border about a little more than 50 years ago. I'm sitting on a beautiful platform, which is used under the wedding canopy at Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, looking out at Bethlehem. It's a beautiful day in Jerusalem. And beyond Bethlehem, my home in Gush Etzion. But I'm not alone, because who's going to stand under the wedding canopy by herself? I mean, really? I'm here with my old friend, Danny Seaman. Danny, it's so great for you to join me today on the Land of Israel Network.
It's a pleasure, and being under the canopy with you, it's a special day.
We're both very happily married to other people, but we're good friends, so we can do this, and there's no one else around. Anyway, I asked Danny to join me today because we have worked together over the years. We've been fighting the same fight for many, many years, and he's got a fairly new position in an organization that I've admired for a long time. But before we get into that, I just wanted Danny to tell you guys who don't know him as well as I do a little bit about what he's been up to for the last, 35 years. First of all, where are you from? What's a little bit about your personal background?
Well, originally from the United States, as you can tell. Not anywhere in particular. I was an Air Force brat. My dad was in the American Air Force. My mom was Israeli. They met in Germany. I was born in Germany. And every year until I was 10 years old, we lived in a different Air Force base in different places, Turkey and the United States. And when I was 10, my father ended his service, and they decided to move to Israel. I grew up in Ashkelon, in the south of Israel, when I was 10 years old. Until after my military service, I served as a paratrooper. I actually served with Mike Oren, the former ambassador. He and I were in the same company. And after the war in Lebanon, I went to the States and began working with the Israeli consulate there, and started my professional career working on behalf of the State of Israel. They took advantage of my knowledge of English and my ability to speak. And I worked at the consulate in New York in academic affairs, on campuses, etc. Spoke on behalf of Israel, gathered the experience. And then for 35 years, I've been a government employee, working beginning with the Foreign Ministry, and then with the Prime Minister's office, and then 2 years with the IDF Spokesman's Unit, with the Foreign Press, and basically with the Government Press Office for 20-some years. And I'd been the director of the Government Press Office, the body within the Office of the Prime Minister that handles the foreign press in Israel. So I had my hands full for a very long time. In the period between 2000 and 2010, I was the director dealing with the foreign press and their coverage of Israel, and retired. It'll be 4 years now. Retired 4 years ago as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Public Diplomacy, basically Hasbara. So that's what I've been doing my entire life. And since then, did a few things. Worked with the Voice of Israel, the old channel we worked at, which was a great opportunity. And now began working with the English language edition of Midah magazine, which is an Israeli right-wing conservative intellectual magazine.
Okay, so before we get into Midah, when I really got to know you well, before we worked together at the Voice of Israel for that year, was when you were the director of the Government Press Office. And I remember going in there at the time. I had a press card also, and hearing foreign journalists grouse about you, because as opposed to many other government employees who just keep their head down, do their job, do whatever orders are coming in, you were not going to let people get away with it. They were getting away with. A lot of the journalists that are based here in Israel, because it's a free and democratic country, feel that they've got the right to lie about things happening here. And then because they're based in Israel, everyone thinks it's fine. And this is before it became fashionable to have the untruths that we see out there. This isn't going on for a long time. And I remember you specifically saying that you even didn't let them have their press card here in Israel. What were those years like for you? Because I remember it was not simple. You were not Mr. Popularity when it came to foreign journalists.
Well,
I say that in a good way.
I never thought that my job was to be popular. I was assigned a role by the government of Israel. And by the way, I was summoned by the Knesset at times because the foreign press had complained about me, and there was an official investigation into supposedly my conduct. And at the Knesset, when I presented my position there, I said to them, as the point I want to make right now is that I swore an oath to the State of Israel. The oath did not say do what is convenient for me. It said to uphold the laws of the State of Israel. Now, by the time I was appointed director of the Government Press Office, I had been working with the foreign press in Israel for 10 years. And I came with an attitude towards the media, like a lot of people in our generation, that we grew up on the stories of the press that are, they're how can I put it in the best way? Clark Kent, Walter Cronkite, that they're there for the American way, for truth, justice.
No agenda, honest journalism, just pure facts, and you can figure it out on your own. No editorializing in the middle of a news article.
Right. We all know Lois Lane. We all know that. And this is the impression that I had. So I had a tremendous respect for these people, and I met a lot of them, and some of them were people that we'd seen and we'd read their names, so that leaves a very strong impression on you. And slowly and gradually, I started seeing that they don't really behave in the way that perhaps Hollywood had told us. And this was all fine until the year 2000. The year 2000, when the Palestinian violence erupted in violation of the Oslo Agreement, what I saw was, if up until that point of time we could have tolerated what they were doing, at this point it became very strategic in the effect it was having on the state of Israel. If until, I would say, the 80s, Israel was the darling of the world, and again, Hollywood had its impact here with the movies of Exodus, exactly, all this positive image of Israel, that started to deteriorate over time. And within the 90s, about the time of the Oslo Agreement, that sort of the onus of the issue here switched from being Israel and concentrating on Israel and the return of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. And
us as the indigenous population, and suddenly we were the colonizers, and other people had been here forever.
Right, and we contributed to that. Our government, in their own stupidity, contributed to that point. But if between 94 and 2000 it was okay and who cared, it didn't really have an effect, by the moment they started an assault on not only legitimacy of Israel, but also physical assault on Israel, and when the media were cooperating with this for different reasons, at that point we could no longer turn a blind eye or ignore it. There were reasons for this. One of it was ideological. Some of them felt were identified with the Palestinian cause. A lot of them coming out of college and the years of the effect. We see a lot of this happening today. The effect that college has on people. But here you have in the liberal values that they held. The story became the Palestinian story, and the Palestinians adopted, and this Tom Friedman, who's never right about anything, but in this case he did say something right. He said that the Palestinians adopted the same tactics in Judea and Samaria once the Palestinian Authority was created that they had done in Lebanon 10 years before, which was threats and violence and coercion. And the journalists, if they wanted to have access, if they wanted to do anything, they would, even if they weren't ideologically supportive of the Arabs, they couldn't say a word because they wouldn't have access. And as I said, the story became the Palestinian story. They all wanted that access, which meant that they had to be critical of Israel. And fine, there's a place to criticize us, but if it's only one-sided, and now you're in a war, and this became part of the cognitive warfare against Israel and to influence public opinion. And Israel, being a democratic society, we're very, the public opinion, international public opinion, is necessary for us to be able to even defend ourselves. And in the year 2000, we saw that this was a problem, perhaps in two major issues. One, when the violence erupted, it basically started, they all accused Ariel Sharon for going to the Temple Mount. Had nothing to do with it. I actually looked at this. The events around, the few days around that, were very similar to other peaks that we had over the years. What really caused it was something that the Palestinians, together with the media, pushed, which was the Al-Dura affair. People may not know what Al-Dura means, but you remember the image of the young boy and his father behind a barrel, supposedly being fired at by Israelis. And this was the blood libel that was promoted by the media, and there was no evidence to it. There was no facts to it. There was no the journalists just pushed it based on footage provided by a Palestinian photographer. This erupted, and the second issue was the lynching in Ramallah, where 2 Israeli soldiers were lynched, and the Palestinians trying to prevent the distribution of the images coming from there by physically and violently assaulting and threatening journalists.
There's one particular image that people might remember of a guy, an Arab, standing at the window of a house with his hands covered with blood. They had just murdered one of the Israeli reservists who had accidentally wandered into Ramallah. And I remember reading that I think it was an Italian journalist who had covered that story, had to flee for his life here. But you know what, Danny, it wasn't just here. It was also, isn't it Easton Jordan from CNN, who said the same thing was happening in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. Journalists out in the Middle East, outside of Israel, which is a democracy and for free press, are being intimidated into lying about the stories. But here it becomes a real existential threat.
It does, and here it's what really bothered me was that the journalists were aware of it, and it is a free society, so why don't they speak up about it? And there was this pack mentality. because there were central figures among the journalists who a lot of the other journalists looked up to, that they were saying one thing, and if you didn't fall into line, you're basically exonerated by them.
The opposite of exonerated.
I'm looking for the word that they were.
We've both become semilingual in 2 languages, not bilingual. Yes, you weren't liked by them, right?
So when we had this incident,
excommunicated, maybe?
Excommunicated is the word that I was looking for, and we started looking into this, and there were Israeli camera crews who were working and producers who came to us and said, "What are you talking about? This is not just happening now. This has been going on for years." And they started providing us with the information as to what was happening there. And we realized that this, you're calling about fake news started here in the Middle East. And this was the essence of it, was in their coverage of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. And they're supporting the Palestinians. So
they still do that in Gaza, for example. When Israel shoots back, let's say, at a mosque, because we're being shot at from a mosque, and everyone's saying, "Oh no, Israel's just shooting at civilians." And later on, journalists will come out and say, "No, we saw them shooting from inside the mosque." Israel was 100% right in trying to defend itself. But during the war, and when public opinion is being shaped as to how Israel is fighting a war, they're either keeping quiet, which is the same as lying by not reporting the truth, and therefore it really becomes a threat to Israel. And we've paid for it with Israeli lives.
Well, that's exactly it. You touched on the essence of the problem. If they're lying about it, it affects our ability to take, because we know that there's a short period of time that the international community will allow us, understanding that we're not at fault here. But the moment public opinion starts pressurizing these governments abroad, then they start putting pressure on Israel, which limits our ability to achieve our strategic needs in a conflict. But with the journalists, which was my responsibility, I realized I had to do several things. One was the offices here were flooded with Palestinians. They were cheaper. Every one of the foreign press had...
Like what they call stringers, like people going along with their journalists to show them what story to get?
It's several things. They started out as being helping them on the ground, but they were also less expensive than Israelis, in violation of Israeli law and the agreements of Oslo, where Israelis charge for taxes and social security and then give it back to the Palestinians. Here they signed agreements with them under the table, which made it much cheaper, and then they didn't funnel the money back to Israel, but they were much cheaper than hiring Israelis, for example. The camera crews were vital in this sense, because the camera crews are the ones who take the images, and when you're blocking the Israelis from being there, who upheld professional standards more than even the foreigners who didn't really care. If they came here and the Palestinians were telling them what to do, they just ignored it. What do they care? The Israelis, trying to uphold professional standards, would speak out. And so the offices gradually just got rid of the Israelis working for them. That happened first. Second, they started moving into the offices in Jerusalem. And what happens is when you have journalists parachuted in times of crisis, and the year 2000 was a period of crisis, we had more foreign press covering Israel than any place else in the world. When they're parachuted into Israel, what happens is that they're influenced by these colleagues of theirs, these Palestinians, and they become embedded factually into Palestinian society. And we all know the importance of the embedding, which the Americans started in the first Gulf War, was that when you're with the American troops, for example, it's no longer these faceless, nameless American soldiers. They're suddenly Billy Bob and Jane, and they get to know them, and they can to identify with them. Here you have complete identification with the Palestinians. Now, I don't mind them identifying it, but uphold your professional standards. So
there was also no context, and some of the journalists that I met with were completely oblivious to any kind of history whatsoever. Even basic facts like how Israel came into existence and what has happened in the last century, they did not know. They just wanted to write what they wanted to write, get their editor to sign off on it, and be at the American Colony Bar for happy hour at 5 p.m. And some of them even said this to me. How can you be a journalist without any sense of context or what part of the story you're reporting?
Exactly. And here's where the problem was that, let's say you see police officers arresting somebody. If you don't know what the context is, if you don't, then you're going, oh, it's a police state. It's horrible how they're treating people. And if the person is yelling bloody murder, I'm innocent, and you're getting this image of and here you have this, the Israel Goliath suddenly, the armed to the teeth Israeli soldiers beating on the poor Palestinians. But there's a reason for this. The context is that they're fighting against the existence of the state of Israel. They kept saying to journalists, well, you can't put the context into every scene. Yes, but if you are not doing it with context and just filling with what they're saying, and just repeating what they're saying, what you're doing is being a propagandist for the Palestinian cause.
So there was one famous picture I remember, which was altogether a Jewish boy who'd been beaten up by Arabs, and when the photographer came, he was watching the Israeli police help him, but they took it as this was an Arab kid that the Israeli police had just beaten up, and that was front page news, and go walk that back. That was the image that most people had in their minds.
It's even worse. They said that this was the Israeli police beating on a Palestinian on the Temple Mount. This is, by the way, the incident that started the organization called Honest Reporting. Following the expose of this, the person who was supposedly the Palestinian there, he was a religious Jewish kid who was assaulted by Palestinians. The police had saved him. And what you see in the background where it's raised the question was that it was a sign of a gas station. There are no gas stations on the Temple Mount. So here, with something so clear, now the photograph was a Palestinian, the person reporting was a Palestinian, and this was for, I believe it was for Reuters. I apologize if it wasn't them. It was one of the news agencies, and they just took it verbatim and put it up and cooperated with Palestinian propaganda. All these things, when you have all of these antagonistic or anti-Israeli things, it has this influence of sheer volume of negativity against Israel affects the way people see things. So at that time, when first I did two things. By the way, I created no new laws and no...
You just upheld what was already on the books.
Well, first thing I said, there's no reason for Palestinians to be employed by the foreign media here in Israel. The moment the Palestinian Authority was created, they have separate... they were allowed to be given permits and to work in Israel. I also checked with the media. Why do you need so many Palestinians working for you? If you need to cover their area, you have people in those territories. Why do you need them in the offices here? So I stopped issuing press credentials to the Palestinians. There was no need for that. I tell them, give me some names of people that you need. If you need Arabic speakers, hire Israeli Arabs. Just so you know that the Haaretz newspaper, which is also, it's a cesspool of it's not only a news organization, but they attacked me at that time and they said that I was racist. I said, why racist? Because you want them to hire Jews. I never said Jews. I told them to hire Israelis. There are enough Israeli Arabs to do a professional job that they should give them employment if they need Arabic speakers. And the second thing, I refused to allow camera crews from abroad to work in Israel. Now, they could come if it was a short period of time, like any place else in the world. The Prime Minister now is in the United States. You have Israeli camera crews being with him. They can't stay in the United States. Israeli camera crews just can't work for the Israeli television in New York or in Washington. They need to hire local people. The same thing with Europe. So all I did was enforce laws that exist everywhere else in the world and that Israel turned a blind eye to for a long time. They were not happy about it. They were unpleased about it, and then they felt that we were attacking, or they accused us of attacking the media. I sometimes say if some of the Israeli public here knew how vicious and how vile some of these people were against the state of Israel and knew the stuff that I knew about what was going on with the foreign press and their cooperation and collaboration with the Palestinian Authority, they would have been violent towards these media themselves. I kept a lot of the information that I had received silent. By the way, a lot of journalists came and gave me information because they said they were sick of it as well. They said that they were seeing the profession going down the drain and they were not pleased with it. Palestinians themselves were telling me they were happy that I was insisting that they uphold professional standards. This is important for them themselves. The only ones who weren't happy were the Foreign Press Association and international groups supposedly protecting journalists who were very critical of what I was doing, and I was constantly under assault.
Mm-hmm. So, we talk about free press and we talk about no censoring, but there has to be within that, it can't just be the freedom to lie. There has to be still within there some kind of standards. Were you able, wasn't there a couple times that you were able to actually rescind the licenses of certain people who were just so awful? And it's too bad that you couldn't do it from Haaretz. For those of you listening who don't know about Haaretz, it's a great newspaper if you're toilet training your puppy. And as much as we like to complain and justifiably so about the foreign press, one of the worst offenders to when it comes to nasty things about Israel and vile lies is unfortunately the Israeli paper Haaretz. But go ahead, Danny. Sorry.
You're making valid points here with Haaretz newspaper. One of the things that bothered us was they have a very progressive and extreme left-wing position. They have an English version. We polled the journalists, and we got it from over 400 of them responded to the poll to find out what are their sources of information. 100% of them, every single one who answered, said that they get the information from Haaretz newspaper. Only 20% of them have other sources. meaning reading Jerusalem Post or other sources. And Israel's an open society. There are a lot of venues and opportunities to get information. They were not seeking it, and they were just looking. They hung out with each other. They hung out with Israeli leftists. They read Haaretz newspaper. So they weren't exposed to other aspects of it. We even tried at that time to get them to meet with Israeli public, and we offered them that there were a lot of Israelis who were volunteering to host journalists, meaning for Shabbat dinner, and this backfired, surprisingly. We were sort of we couldn't understand why they were going and being hosted by Israelis and turning out and being more. And we found out that, let's say that somebody from California was hosting a journalist from California. They went to the same schools. What eventually turned out in my conversations with the journalists is that they identified with these people, saying, here, person grew up the same place I went to, the same schools and everything. How could they be so stupid and see things so different than I do? And they became hostile to these people. It was stunning to see this. I think psychologists could look at this and see, because here they were face to face with people who had lived here, experienced what we experienced, and therefore saw things differently than these journalists. And the journalists were antagonistic towards them as a result, not thinking maybe we should look at ourselves and question why are we holding the positions we are, and trying to understand why these people who are very similar to us see things differently. They didn't care about that. All they cared about was they had an agenda. They wanted to move it forward, and anybody who had said anything else was the enemy in their eyes. What we see is happening today. It all started here.
Mm-hmm. So did you have anybody booted out of here?
Okay, well, you see, this is the thing. When you have bona fide media, it's not our role to tell them who, if the New York Times appoints somebody here, fine. Israeli media the same way. If it's a bona fide journalist, we don't determine the quality of their journalism. By the way, with the Al-Dura case, which I told you, the culprits or the ones who were most responsible for this were France 2, French television, and an Israeli correspondent who works for them. My office was actually sued by Nitzana Darshan-Leitner to take away the press credentials. I had...
Wait, Nitzana Darshan-Leitner sued the government, not you. She sued the government press office because she felt that the press credentials should be taken away. So you were okay with what she was doing on that level?
Absolutely. This gave me an opportunity to present what our problems with them are, but I had to say, I recognize somebody working for a bona fide media organization. I don't evaluate the quality of that person in giving them a press credentials. That's their problem. This gave us a wonderful opportunity to show why we felt that they had failed as professional journalists. Let the organization deal with it. What we had prevented happening, what happened very often here, was all these activists who were coming and bypassing the legal restrictions on them setting in Israel, and they were political activists. And they were getting letters of not accreditation, but they were getting these letters from different organizations in Scandinavia and Spain, even the United States. They were saying, this person will be providing us with materials. No, I want to know if he or she is employed by you physically.
Like fake press credentials in order to come here and promote an agenda.
Exactly. And we were able to fight that. We said, look, we want to see a contract. If that person is working for you, I want to see that you're, at that time, it wasn't like today where you had a lot of these people working on contracts and not fully employed. But we want to see a contract. Are you going to pay them or not? Now, certainly when it came to that and they had suddenly liability for these people, they were very quick not to give them letters of accommodations anymore. And so we were able to not give them press credentials. A lot of the activists were not happy about that and they went to and they did do work. What did they do? They hung out and they did things, and then they reported it to the journalists. I don't even think they were paid for it. They had done it just in order to be involved politically and political activists against the state of Israel. So that was the one thing we did. The second thing was limit the foreign camera crews from working here and not taking away jobs from Israelis and photographers. They weren't pleased with that either. That was about the only thing. There were several cases in which journalists had violated laws of the state of Israel, in which, based on that, we rescinded, and these were visiting journalists. We had one time with the BBC, there was a situation where they had violated Israeli law by interviewing the spy, Vanunu, the nuclear spy, right? And this was against Israeli law, and and cooperating with terrorists or violating the censorship in Israel could be a year in jail. So we started addressing those issues of violations of the Israeli law. These are laws, by the way, that exist in the United States, exist in Europe, the same thing. So this was nothing different than what was happening, but they allowed themselves to violate the laws here in Israel. So at those times, we had restrictions placed on certain journalists. Again, they weren't too happy about it. And then there was this visiting journalist from Scandinavia, for example, who perpetrated a blood libel, saying that Israelis were dealing with the organs and taking organs from the bodies of Palestinians. And this is one of the old anti-Semitic canards so at that point we said we were taking away their press credentials and having them leave. And the other one was an Arab who worked for one of the Arab media organizations who was he was expelled from Israel because during the operation in Judea and Samaria and Ramallah, he was saying that we wanted them to surrender. So there doesn't have to be conflict. All the men would have to show up at a particular location. The Israelis would check their credentials, see who they are, and if they were involved in terrorism, apprehend them. If not, release them. This was a way to prevent having to have combat situations. It was working out nicely until this media organization said that when the Israelis, when they're coming to the Islamic center in the middle of Ramallah, Israelis are taking them out in the back and executing them, which at that point, who would surrender at that point? So as a result of that, he was expelled from the state of Israel. So it was very limited. It wasn't the way they were presenting it. Basically, what we were demanding is that they uphold professional standards. We were getting rid of those who were not professional journalists, and anybody who violated the laws of the state of Israel paid a price, basically being expelled from Israel.
You know, as we're sitting here, and I don't know if my listeners can hear it in the background, the muezzin, the call to prayer, the Islamic call to prayer, they pray 5 times a day. And that's just happening and we don't even notice it, Danny, anymore, just because it's just part of the background of life here in Israel. So again, for those of you who haven't been here yet and who really are even semi-believing the lies of a restrictive state and an anti-Muslim, anti-Christian state, just forget about it. This is, I think, one of the freest countries in the world. And especially given what we're up against, it's astonishing how much freedom of movement people here, how much freedom of speech people have over here. But when it comes to the press, to get back to what you were saying, they can't do everything that they want. So in the last 15 years, there's been really a tremendous explosion of bypassing the mainstream media, especially on the internet. Now every cell phone is also a camera. So people are able to video things as they want to, still take them out of context, though. So now you're not in the GPO anymore. You don't have to deal with that. Do you think things have gotten better in the last few years, worse in the last few years, because there are now alternate ways of finding your news? And before I forget, also, I wanted to ask you about Al Jazeera and the controversy a few months ago about closing the Al Jazeera office here in Israel, which also comes out of Qatar. I mean, these people are anti-everybody, but definitely anti-Israel. So I just threw a bunch of things at you.
Yeah, let's see.
Mainstream.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what... has things become better or worse? It's hard to say. This is basically something that happened in the past 5 to 10 years. 15 years ago, in the midst of the Palestinian violence, you only had the mainstream media to rely upon. So when you had suicide bombings in Israel, when you had cafes being blown up and buses and children being murdered, all you had was the professional media. You didn't have, can you imagine, images? People would just pick out their cameras or their phones and take images you would understand what is happening today in New York, in Manchester, in France, in Spain, in all over. This was our life for a very long time. And I have to say, because the people didn't address, or governments didn't address this and were forgiving because it was just happening to Jews, you all are paying the price today. Because you let them understand that this is acceptable. So I
say this all the time. My listeners know this. If you think it's just about the Jews and about Israel, we are the trailer. This is coming attractions. And if you don't stop the evil with us, it's going to come your way. And not just something from the last 5 or 10 years, but all the way down through history.
Yeah, we're the canary in the mine here, and this was our life for a very long time. Actually, today if it's anything's better, our life here, I feel much safer in Israel now than any place else in the world, because we know how to address this, we know how to handle it. And I'll say even more than that, we have many more Arabs living amongst us than you have, yet they understand themselves that they're better off than their brethren in all around the Middle East. So they may not be happy about Israel, but they're much prefer being with us and under our responsibility than their own corrupt leadership. But we're talking about the media, and I would say Before Al Jazeera, I'm saying that, yes, today people have the ability to impact. We saw this exactly this week, 5 years ago, with the operation in the Gaza Strip. And this was the first time, at that time I was with the Ministry of Public Diplomacy, and we had wanted to use the public and have them assist us as volunteers. Between what we had imagined and what happened in reality, it was embarrassing how different it was. We were not aware of how social media has become so prevalent and so useful. When we were expecting volunteers to come in and operate phones and call Jewish communities abroad, what actually happened was that the public took over, and public is more credible than the media. So if you had an air raid on Tel Aviv and you had people taking videos of it and posting it themselves and doing they were much more useful and much more many more abilities and much more credible than the government had. And that was the first time we used that. The first few days was just watching what these kids, these 20-year-olds, now they're in their 30s, but these 20-year-olds were doing. I was astounded by. So I didn't even have Facebook at that time. To me, it was like an invasion of privacy. And now I see that it's, now I'm into it because of that generation. I had left government at that time recommending that they train the public not what to say, but how to use all these things and all these abilities and give them direction in order to increase. For the first time in the 30 years that I worked for Israel at that time, I saw that there was a game changer. Up until then, I always said it's like a game of tic-tac-toe. You have their arguments and our arguments, and anybody over 4 years old knows that you can't win at tic-tac-toe. Even if you remember the movie War Games back in the early 80s, Shall We Play a Game? It's basically the same thing when you come to the cognitive warfare. 70% of the people don't know. We say we have 20% on their side, 10% on our side, and 70% who really don't know and don't care. The ability to reach out to these 70% today through social media is vitally important, because this way people can really see and identify with what is going on. So yes, in that sense, it has improved. And journalists have to, although media is still the place people go to, but at least now, they always said that they represented the people. And this was basically my argument with them at the time was, you say you represent the people, why are you coming with this flag of representing them? And you're just pushing your own agenda. Today, every one of them can be challenged and questioned because there are alternatives that can challenge what the journalists are telling you. And that's why I say use different sources of information before deciding and before establishing an opinion, because always know, even the journalists carry some kind of personal agenda and opinion, but always question it and hold them to standards. And this is one of the things that we also did at the time, was holding the journalists to standards, which leads us to Al Jazeera. Whereas you'll have the BBC, New York Times, French television, Western media, at the end of the day, they do have professional standards that they claim to uphold. And they are there. Now, they're the fourth estate. They're the ones who are supposed to, in a democratic society, be the ones who are providing the information for the public for us to make our decision. This does not happen in the Arab world. There is no such thing in the Arab world. There is no democracy. There is no freedom of thought. Even Al Jazeera, it's not that it came from the public or some initiative by democratic-minded people. No, this was the initiative of the Emir of Qatar, who wanted this as a tool to fight his opponents in the Arab world and put them on the spot and have them under pressure. Originally, it was a good idea. I even supported it here in Israel. Originally, the Al Jazeera that was here was actually a Palestinian production company, and we refused to give them press credentials. We said that if Al Jazeera wants to be recognized, they should behave like the New York Times or Washington Post or any other professional media organization, open up offices in Israel, employ people, not necessarily Israelis, but have people who work for you here. They met that challenge. They opened up offices. They did everything professionally. I was very pleased with that at the time. And I'll tell you, this was just around the period of the Second Gulf War, the war in Iraq. And Bush was pushing elections. And I said, elections are not a sign of a democracy. They're a consequence of democracy. Real democracy is freedom, is the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, et cetera, and freedom of journalism. So if we can encourage them to have free press there, this is the way but I won't say quickly, but gradually we saw that there was something happening there. And as we investigated, we found out that the Muslim Brotherhood, which are the most extreme element, and they're the ones behind the world jihad, they're the ones behind Hamas, they're behind every movement to create a caliphate, an Islamic, not one Islamic state stretching from Spain in the west all the way to the Muslim countries in the Far East, and eventually taking over Europe and restoring the highlight of Islam. The Emir of Qatar, in order to have them or to pacify them in his own country, gave them the ability to take control. And we found out we were suspicious that they were taking over control in Al Jazeera. This was basically confirmed for us with a conversation I had with some of the foreign press they actually went out and hired a lot of the professionals in the foreign media. One of them was Mike Hanna from CNN. And Mike Hanna, I had a lot of respect for him because he was one of the people who tried to uphold professional standards. When CNN were presented with the Al Dura footage, for example, he refused based on professional standards. He says, who took these pictures? Where is there anything confined? You don't see Israelis fight. He refused to air it that day. That's why the French television took it. What happened was this story became a story, ballooned into a story within its own, and even CNN started reporting it afterwards. But Mike also moved over to Al Jazeera. And he was the head of the news there. And in the beginning, I was sort of suspicious of the intention of the journalists. I said, all right, they're getting a lot of money. They'll go there and turn a blind eye. No, they really believed, and very much as I saw Al Jazeera, they believed in it also as a way of promoting freedom in the Arab world. And Mike admitted to me that they were unhappy with what they were seeing with that Muslim Brotherhood took over the Arabic version, and they were trying to get inroads into the English version and affect it as well. They were fighting it. They eventually lost that fight. He didn't say that to me. I followed this for a few years. They eventually lost it. And it is not a free organization, but actually it is the propaganda arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they're part of the combatants, not only against Israel, against the entire Western world. They are the propaganda, the Hanoi Jane, well, Hanoi Jane was an American, but Tokyo Rose and other propagandists. And allowing them, it's like saying you see a policeman in a Western society walking around yelling Allahu Akbar and shooting civilians, and you say, no, he's a police officer because he's wearing the uniform. This is the same with Al Jazeera. They are not a bona fide media organization. Allowing them and giving them that kind of credibility is allowing them to be part of the war against the West. Wars today are very different from what we grew up with and understanding. It's no more longer you have one enemy on one side and the good guys on the other side. Today they use anything at their benefit. They are the weaker side when it comes to fighting the West. So they use anything to undermine stabilities of these regimes. It can be through academia, certainly propaganda, and using the media. And that's what Al Jazeera is. It's an enemy combatant. And if we continue giving it credibility here in Israel, how does it contribute? It incites the Arab population here. It is the major source of information. It became, because in the beginning it was different. It was criticizing the Arab regimes. Arabs were turning to this because it was something they had never seen before. So like I said, they played on the positive aspects of media and then quickly became manipulative. And now, if it's manipulative against the Arab world, well, they know they have their preferences. We all know how this works. If you support, say, President Bush, and you hear MSNBC criticizing him, okay, you listen to them, but you have your own personal views. Same thing happens with them. But when they are antagonistic towards Israel in the first place, and you constantly have Al Jazeera pumping that and inciting them and telling them and vilifying Israel, we're trying to pacify the population here and maintain a normalcy.
And have some kind of coexistence. We don't have to love each other, but we can try not to kill each other and have a war. So, ironically, our military strength at keeping the country whole and winning our wars on the battlefield, as you participated in yourself, has meant that it's emboldened that cognitive warfare and the war against us via the media and in other places. So with all your experience here and all these many years of doing so much, you're now with Midah. So tell us a little bit about Midah.
Well, Midah magazine was created about 5-6 years ago by his right-wing intellectuals, led by Ron Baratz, who was a professor of history and philosophy at the Hebrew University, who felt that they were being pushed aside. Media was very one-sided, and they thought there should be some kind of platform to voice conservative opinions. And they started out basically in Hebrew, and it succeeded very well. It gave an opportunity to hear different voices, and basically because the government is right-wing, it has a lot of influence on the government ministers, etc. Mm-hmm. And it's a place to hear alternative views. It's strange to think that the alternative today is reality.
Oh, that's a good alternative reality. The alternative is the reality. Yes.
That's unfortunately what has happened. They've gone so far to propagandize and to press an agenda that you need something that gives a little more of what is happening here. And they decided they wanted to also turn to the pro-Israel crowd, both Jews and non-Jews around the world, who are looking for insights. And so they appointed me as having dealt with this for so many years, appointed me as the English editor of English content. Right now it's articles that are a few people writing for us, and we put up once a day on different issues that are happening here. We're less news-oriented and more into the general topics and giving background.
More into analysis and giving the context. Are you translating the articles that are written in Hebrew? Do you have articles that are written originally in English? You do both?
We do both. I write a few other writers writing for us, Judith Bergman, her husband Daniel, Lital Shemesh, who is an up-and-coming Israeli correspondent, journalist in Israeli media. And we do translate from the Hebrew some of the items. But it's a small outfit right now. We're growing, and we're hoping at the beginning of the year to also start with podcasting and have the people that work at Midah speak about news events, current events, and do different programming. Hopefully from The Voice of Israel, the show that I had with my co-host Daniela Traub, she and I will be doing our take on life in Israel from the perspective of a young woman and a mature, handsome man. And just talk about our lives here so people understand that it's not all news that's happening here. So we're looking into doing that, and then also start doing short videos and perhaps even video programming about what's going on. But that's for the future. And the next
so my listeners, who I would imagine most of them, otherwise why would they be listening to this, fall under the realm of conservative, of looking for constantly for good content to give them perspective and historical background and also really the real voice of what's happening here. Where would they find Midah? It's all online?
It's all online. It's you can find it at midah, mida.org.il, and there's a button that says English there, or if you want the English version, it's en.mida.org.il. You can find us on Facebook as well, and the articles are all there on different topics. For example, next week we'll be putting out something on the relationship between Israel and South Africa, that it's not what people have come to realize and believe to be the truth. There's a lot more to it. So we look for these kind of misconceptions and try to address them with the facts and with the historical facts that shouldn't be debatable.
Okay, and it's all free?
It's all free.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, everybody. So you want to get on to Midah, because I know that a lot of you write to me. You want sources of information. So this is a great one. I've been following Midah for years, but I'm able to read it in the Hebrew, and I keep telling you guys to read Hebrew. But until you get up to the level of reading the articles, go to the English version. And I'm just so happy that Danny Seaman is involved with this, and I know that it'll take off even more than it has, and it's so needed, because even those of us who feel a certain way need the information. It's not enough to just have that feeling in your belly that something is wrong. We all need to be ambassadors of the truth. Nobody can just be sitting around being disgusted by what's happening. We all have to know what the truth is and push it forward, because I think there's a battle for the world going on right now. We talk about this all the time, and if anything, it is only getting worse. So Danny Seaman, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right. It's great to see you again. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation. So thank you all so much for listening. You can write to me, eve@thelandofisrael.com. Always happy to hear from you. Planning my next trip to the States in March. So if you want to see me in person, now would be the time to get in touch. Take care, everybody. So glad to be on the station. Have a great week. Goodbye.